The one thing that you need to understand about Texas is it is hard country. If you're not from here, you may have gotten a whiff of that, but Austin's pretty. Austin's kind of shiny. Austin's kind of new. But historically, Texas has been long on land and short on water. And as a result, it was a despoblado. It was a place that people really didn't want to go live if they could help it. Even when you go back all the way to the indigenous peoples, they were not the people that were building temples and cities and grand civilizations. They were the people that were looking for any breath of shade and breeze and hoping to stay away from larger, more powerful neighbors. They were small groups that wandered about, with the exception of a group in East Texas. Some lawmakers in Texas were a little concerned that the story of Texas was getting kind of lost, or in many ways garbled. So they said, what can we do about this? Well, we need to tell the story of Texas in some way that's accessible. So great. I caught wind of this when I'm out there in Kerrville, came over to the Capitol just up the street, and I said, what do you guys have in mind? And then they said, well, here's the bill. I'm talking to Tan Parker, who's senator from up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he says, I've got to take a call, but I'll come back and we can visit about it. Well, it's my first time to be interacting with a lawmaker. So I got the bill and I read it and I said, I'm going to mark this up. So I marked it up, and when he came off of his phone call, I said, hey, I took the liberty of marking up your bill because I figured you'd want it to pass both houses. So you need to put some language in there that is not going to antagonize people. You know, for starters, you're starting with 1836 as the beginning of this story. And that is going to be leading with your chin a little bit, because there's a couple of 100 years ahead of that where stuff was going on here. You know, I'd like to say that Texas started on day 8 of Genesis. So, you know, if we're going to be really truthful in the telling, we'd probably better roll it back. And so Senator Parker said, you know what, that's a great idea, made the changes, incorporated the changes, and the bill passed into law without a whole heck of a lot of debate, which is pretty rare in Austin. So the bill called for a panel to be composed of 3 appointees from the governor's office, 3 from the lieutenant governor's office, and 3 from the Speaker of the House. So I got nominated by the governor to head this thing up. So my first question was, all right, in the law, we have to deliver the story of Texas in a brochure format. So I said, what is the legal definition of a brochure? And the answer was, well, we were kind of hoping you'd tell us. So I said, well, a brochure needs to be big enough that you won't throw it away, but small enough that it's a handy coaster and you'll keep tripping over it until you either read it or hand it off to somebody. So I said, great, that's now the legal definition of a brochure. I said, well, who's going to write this story of Texas that'll fit into a brochure? And they said, well, we were kind of hoping you would help us with that too. So all of a sudden, every word that I put into that brochure carried a payload. Language matters. How you tell a story matters. You can't exactly AI this. Hey, AI is very helpful, but AI is still pretty stupid. So still needed some, people involved in this whole process. And so what we have in the back is actually the delivery on the first promise of that 1836 project law, which was a nice, easy to carry, down and dirty story of Texas. So if you guys pass out from the heat or you got low blood sugar and you don't remember a thing I say, that's fine. Homework's in the back. All right. The thing that's interesting about that brochure is the lawmaker said, let's distribute this at driver's license offices. I said, man, that's a great idea, because there's all sorts of people moving to Texas. And there's all sorts of 16-year-olds that didn't pay attention in Coach Pringle's class. So getting your driver's license is in effect like a squeeze chute where you work cattle. Everybody's got to go through that squeeze chute, and you can be handed a brochure. What you do with it after that's up to you. Same with y'all. It's back there. It's yours. It's paid for. I'm not taking a single one with me back to Kerrville. So take as many as you want. All right. So the story of Texas is complicated, but it's extraordinarily important for you guys to understand what you are reading into. You know, Texas is about to have the largest population in the country. And in the form of government that we have, a constitutional republic, numbers matter. So if Texas is going to be the most populous state, one might argue that it will become the most important state as well. And important from in terms of not only the electoral college and all that stuff, but also in its sort of political heft. So Texas needs to get it right. Texas needs people to help it get it right. All right. That's why this story matters. So let's roll it back a bit. I can kind of see some shapes in the back. How many of you guys are from out of state? Well, all the out-of-staters sit up front. Very nice. You're in the Gallagher splash zone up here. I'll try not to spit on you. All right. That's great. I'm glad you guys are from out of state because Texas has some catching up to do. It's got some catching up to do with its reputation, and it also needs to be a good federal participant with the other states in the country. So let's roll it back. And actually, let's start with day 8 of Genesis. You know, I was introduced as being the producer of a 250 video series. We're rolling that series out this summer. It's called E Pluribus Texas, and it will be available on YouTube, Vimeo, places like that. Each episode's 5 minutes long because that's the length of our attention span. And so it's a little longer than TikTok, but a little shorter than most of your YouTube material. So E Pluribus Texas will start, that video series starts in the beginning. And I talk about prehistory. One of my pals said, well, why are you starting with, dinosaurs? Because dinosaurs and plankton and creatures that lived millions of years ago all fell to the seabed and became oil. And without oil, Texas is kind of a big overstuffed Alabama. So we're going to start there and roll forward. The one thing that you need to understand about Texas is it is hard country. If you're not from here, you may have gotten a whiff of that, but Austin's pretty. Austin's kind of shiny. Austin's kind of new. But historically, Texas has been long on land and short on water. And as a result, it was a despoblado. It was a place that people really didn't want to go live if they could help it. Even when you go back all the way to the indigenous peoples, they were not the people that were building temples and cities and grand civilizations. They were the people that were looking for any breath of shade and breeze and hoping to stay away from larger, more powerful neighbors. They were small groups that wandered about, with the exception of a group in East Texas that were known as the Hassanai, or the Caddos, as they come down to us. The Caddos had villages. They would occasionally go out and hunt buffalo, and they would move about a bit, but they always came back home. But other than that, that's kind of the story. A bunch of really poor and next to oblivion people trying to do the best they can in this region. Now, they did it for 10,000 years, so they must have done something right. Not like they all just died one day. All right, so that's kind of the deep dive into it. Let's get into the contact between Europe and these indigenous peoples. That's kind of how you always hit American history. And most American history is written from, Boston looking southwest. Fight me on that one, I'm telling you. And I'm going to tell you American history that's from the Southwest looking back towards Boston. So the first folks that lay eyes on Texas happened to do that in 1519. And they cruise along the coast of Texas while Cortez and the other conquistadors are doing their thing down with the Mexica, the Aztecs, in central Mexico. The Spanish were sailing along the coast of the Gulf and mapping it. So a guy named Pineda saw the coast of Texas for the first time, and in his notes, it's low, sandy, bad ports. So the first impression ain't so good. Well, the next impression we have of Texas is from a Spanish castaway, a guy by the name of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Now, Cabeza de Vaca, how'd you like to be named, Cowhead? Well, that's him. Cabeza de Vaca was the royal accountant that the Spanish always included on any of their operations. Now, why would you have a corps of fighting accountants? Well, it's pretty easy. So the king gets his cut. Colonizing, exploring, and conquest was a big business to Spain. And in order for that business to pay, you had to know exactly what the debits and credits were looking like on the expedition. So Cabeza de Vaca, the fighting accountant, finds himself with an expedition that starts out in Florida, cruising along the Gulf Coast. Big storms, hurricanes come in, wreck the ships. The survivors are all trying to figure out, this is bad. Let's get back to Mexico however we can. They slaughter their horses, make little leather boats, and go out into the Gulf of Mexico. And guess what? All the boats kind of fall apart, and they find themselves on Galveston Island. Cabeza de Vaca was one of the few survivors. He is enslaved by the local tribes. They said, great, we can use this guy to carry water, carry wood. Well, Cabeza de Vaca had, some college behind him. And he figured out that if he knew how to apply a really good Band-Aid in a little Neosporin, it might fix some of these Indian ailments that he was encountering in camp. You think about it. You have a thorn injury. It could go septic. You could get blood poisoning. You could die. Cabeza de Vaca knew how to kind of treat those minor wounds. And sometimes they even knew how to take out a arrow point or something like that. So the Indian said, man, you're way too good to haul wood and water. You're kind of a shaman. And he kind of put together a traveling roadshow of being, the smart wizard that went from tribe to tribe to tribe. He came back finally to Mexico, and they said, well, what did you see up there? And he said, nothing. It looks rough. The people were poor. They were all on the edge of existence. I don't know. Said, but I will tell you, they did talk about cities of fabulous wealth. Masai, over the hill, over the horizon, somewhere up north. Well, that was singing the Spanish song there. So they said, great, we're going to go find these great, fabulous empires over the horizon. They just conquered Mexico. They'd just taken in a great haul from there, and then down in Peru, they were looking for Nuevo Mexico. Nuevo Mexico. And if you're a man on the make and you'd missed Mexico and Peru, man, this might be your chance. A couple of expeditions set out. One went through Florida up through the southeast. Another one went up through what is now Arizona and into West Texas. After several years, the survivors went back and said, there's absolutely nothing worth having up there. Welcome to Texas, y'all. Y'all are now standing on ground that nobody wanted for a very long time. What ends up happening is the Spanish don't want Texas until somebody else acts like they do. Now, most of the visiting students are of a certain age where you know how that trick works. Really, you're not going to ask me out? Well, so-and-so's thinking about it. all of a sudden you get a lot better looking. And that's exactly sort of the dynamic that's happening in Texas. As the French start snooping around, and the French are a nation on the make, and the Spanish are feeling a little dicey about their French neighbors. And when the French make their appearance in Texas, the Spanish take note. Now, the French were probably in Texas quite by accident. The same breezes that blew Cabeza de Vaca onto Galveston Island also blew La Salle onto the coast of Texas. But it didn't matter. The Spanish were extraordinarily concerned that the French might influence the indigenous peoples up there, even though there's not all that many. See, the Spanish were really concerned about turning the indigenous peoples of the Americas into Spaniards, ultimately into taxpayers. Give them a job, let them blend into the culture, and let them become Spanish. And they were extraordinarily successful at that. If you talk to people in Mexico, they will talk about la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race, a people that is composed of all the peoples of the earth, all kind of recast as a new people in Mexico. Well, that was a process that the Spanish were really good at. The French were not nearly as interested in that. They would give the Indians guns and liquor, as long as they didn't point the guns at them. They saw the indigenous peoples as being more of partners than subjects. So the Spanish vision and the French vision are incompatible. That brings the Spanish back to Texas. Did they find anything different than they had 100 years before? Not really. It was still tough country. But they decided to take a swing at the Caddos, turn them into mission Indians, put them into culture factories, have Spaniards emerge on the other end. And the Caddos were doing fine until all of a sudden diseases and plagues swept through the towns. And the Caddos are looking around going, we've been here for 200 years, never had a plague. The Spanish show up, we have a plague. I think the only thing different here is the Spanish. So they boot them. And the Spanish fall back, said, I don't know if we'll ever be able to occupy Texas. There's nothing here for us. And so they struggle. They struggle for 100 years. Finally, they build a population in Texas of about 5,000 people. That's it. Texas is a big place. I don't know if this is new to you, but in case it is, it's a big place. Really big place. I drive all over the state all the time. I put about 30,000 miles on my truck every year, just going to the 254 counties of this place. And to only have 5,000 people in this vast wilderness does not sound like a success story to me. They needed people. They needed people to move to Texas. Nobody was taking them up on the offer. I mean, can you imagine the brochure? Yeah. Short on water, long on mean people, come to Texas. Yeah, it's not a good sales point. So Texas remains largely unoccupied and at the far end of every Spanish concern. So let's kind of look at what's that mean for the 5,000 people that live here. What kind of society do they make? Well, they make a society that relies on itself. If you're at the far end of the line of communications, far end of the supply chain, if you're at the far end of any sort of government services, you learn to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. And that becomes a very key part of living in Texas during the Spanish period. No one is coming to bail you out. You better live by your wits, and you'd better be nice to your neighbors, because you may not like where they park their travel trailer, but there may come a day when you're going to need them. So that starts the beginning of what I would like to call Texasosity. There is kind of a Texas thing that is born from that process. Well, fast forward a bit, and Spain finds itself the proud owner of Louisiana after the French kind of overstepped their bounds a couple of times. And now Texas is a rear area in the Spanish Empire. And then the Americans show up on the Mississippi River. And one thing that is an absolute reality about Americans in the early 19th century is they are aggressive breeders, have huge families, and they trespass. They never met a boundary they didn't observe. So now the Spanish have an issue. They've got immigration coming from the U.S., and that's a problem because they're unoccupied up there in Texas. They've got to populate it with somebody, and the appeal down in Mexico is not going very far. So finally they come up with a plan. Well, maybe we can get some less despicable Americans that'll settle in Texas to start fleshing it out. Well, before they can get that whole plan sorted, Mexico declares its independence from Spain, which leads to about a 10-year-long civil war, which kills probably about 7 million people. It's extraordinarily bloody. It wrecks Mexico. And in one phase of that revolution, that war for independence, there is a separatist movement that happens in Texas. Some Mexican Republicans go to New Orleans. They ask people in New Orleans, y'all want an adventure? The answer in New Orleans is always, of course we do. And into Texas they came. The Spanish responded by not only wiping out the rebels, but killing 1 out of 2 people living in Texas. They slaughtered 2,500 people. What had taken them better than 100 years to gather, the 5,000, is now down to 2,500. Mexico becomes an independent republic. And it's got a problem. Texas. It's unoccupied. Oh, I say that. It is occupied. It's occupied by new and more powerful nations of indigenous peoples. And they tend to wander down into northern Mexico on shopping expeditions. And what they're peddling is horses, and they're also snagging cattle and also children. They're big on snatching kids because you need to repopulate your tribe. The Comanches, the Numina, the people, are extraordinarily sensitive to casualties. They only have a kid about once every 6 years. So they need people to keep up their momentum. They've got a ready market for all the stolen goods, too. Americans in the Midwest are happy to buy every Mexican horse they steal. So a pony that was first frolicking around a pasture near Chihuahua will end up walking along the streets in Indiana or Ohio as a mature horse. Big business. And the Comanches are pretty much calling the shots. Mexico says, we need some people tonight to kind of absorb all that mischief. So once again, they asked people in Mexico, who wants to go to Texas? Few takers. So then they hit upon the idea, well, there's some Americans that have showed up. I think their last name is Austin. And they said they would bring people in. And as long as they bring in the right people, maybe we can have legal immigration into Texas, and they can set up a system that will help create a tide that floats all the Mexican boats across the entire country. They can develop an economy. They can develop a society. They can develop a way of doing business in a very rough country that will serve as a model for the rest of the nation. And that's what they decide to do. So one of the things that is oftentimes perplexing, especially to people that aren't from Texas, is what were the Mexicans thinking? Why would they invite Americans into Texas? Well, because Americans are awesome. They're entrepreneurial. They know how to make something out of absolutely nothing. And that's what Mexico was looking for. You know, the Spanish had kept Mexico pretty backwards and poor. The Americans never saw that as an obstacle. So they start coming into Mexico. They're following the rules. They're learning Spanish. They're becoming Catholic. Everybody's happy. But they write back to Alabama and Mississippi, Tennessee, New York. Says, you can't believe this place. It is awesome. It's the best place we've ever seen. Now, that said, 1519 was a severe economic crisis in American history. There are people that are broke, and we're talking way more broke than Depression broke from the 1930s. And all of a sudden, the Republic of Mexico saying, if you'll come here and agree to be one of us, not just in form, but in substance, we'll give you 4,500 acres. I'd take that bet. Now, before you say, well, no wonder they came to Texas. If I offered you that same deal, I'll give you 4,500 acres. All you got to do is live on it for about 5 years, and it'll have some of the best skiing in the world. It's in a place called Afghanistan. How many of y'all take me up on that bet? Well, anybody that's paying a mortgage or going to church is probably not going to. But if you've got a whole bunch of unpaid parking tickets, maybe a couple of, angry exes, Afghanistan might look like a garden spot. And that's kind of the process. So all of a sudden you have legal immigration that is starting to carry with it illegal immigration. And pretty quickly, Mexico has a roiling illegal immigration problem. So much so that they sent somebody up here to take a long, hard look at Texas, figure out what's going on. And the report that came back was, for every Tejano, and by that I mean anybody living in Texas, doesn't matter where they were born, of the Tejanos up there, for every one that is a native of Mexico, there's about 5 or 6 that are native of the United States. There are whole towns in Mexican Texas where there's no Spanish spoken. And these guys said, this is a problem. Somehow we have lost control of this whole story. And we've got to clamp down. We have to restrict immigration to Texas, however we can. But this same scout that went up there, big expedition, it's Manuel Mieri Terán, he's a general, high-profile guy, said not only are they prolific and not only do they trespass, but every last one of them, tall ones, short ones, fat ones, thin ones, pretty ones, ugly ones, doesn't matter who they are, every last one of them has their constitution in their pocket. And that makes people nervous. Americans know their rights, even while they're breaking the law. Well, Mexico then kind of overreacts, and they try to shut the thing down. And then Mexico falls into a cycle of never-ending civil wars. For instance, between about 1821 and 1854, the United States has maybe 7 governments. Mexico will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 to 60. Depends on how you count them. There is a huge amount of political turmoil in Mexico. And so they have an illegal immigration problem. They've got a problem with the Comanches. They've got problem after problem. The country's broke. Spain tries to retake them, fails. The French get involved. They're always sneaking around the edges. And they just can't pay attention to Texas. But when they do pay attention to Texas, they overreact. And the first thing they ask these Texans is, hey, y'all got any guns or cannons? And the answer is, of course, you gave them to us. And you gave them to us so that we would use them against Comanches. Remember that? They said, well, we'd like them all back. Well, that should have jangled a couple of nerves with those Americans because, their grandparents, maybe their great-grandparents, had heard similar demands at Lexington Green in Concord, Massachusetts. So they say, well, we've got a piddling little gun over here at Gonzales. If you want it, come and take it. And that sort of defiance introduces us to another part of the DNA of Texans. You want it so bad. How bad do you want it? Well, what ends up happening, of course, is the Texas War for Independence, Texas Revolution. They win their independence. It's the details are fascinating, but too complicated to get crushed into this length of time. But it is a fascinating episode in American history where American ideals born in Philadelphia get tested in the field. I argue that all those people that were the framing generation of the United States were actually all Texans. They just hadn't met the place yet. And so those sorts of ideas in Philadelphia get proofed out in the fire of war. And then the trial of being an independent republic. And the reason that Texas did not immediately join the Union is because there were Northerners that just didn't want the expansion of slavery. And Texas, the Texas miracle, the economy had been driven and was increasingly driven by enslaved labor. In that debate over annexing Texas, there was a senator from Massachusetts that said, if Texas is annexed, Massachusetts will secede. To which a senator from South Carolina said, great, we would rather have Texas than Massachusetts anyway. That's the atmosphere of that annexation process. Texas finally is annexed. That leads to war between the United States and Mexico. Ultimately, the way that Texas gets annexed is they played that same old trick. Well, if y'all won't annex us, maybe we'll cut a better deal with the British. They think we're kind of good. So the United States said, no, in order to keep the British out of this part of the continent, we'd better take them, as much as we're not sure we like them. War with Mexico happens. Texas is now a state. How big a state? Nobody quite knows. If you ask Texans, at one time they'd claim the western boundary of the state, of the republic, as the Gulf of Mexico. No, I'm sorry, the Gulf of California, the Pacific Ocean. So all of our friends that are visiting today from California, you're just living in the occupied West Bank. One day, the annexation will happen. But nobody really knew what the western boundary of Texas was, and that's a problem when you're talking about the issues of slavery. Because slavery needs to be contained in order to be eradicated. Slavery must expand in order to remain economically viable. And so the annexation of Texas, the resulting war with Mexico, the Mexican cession leads to the American Civil War. After the American Civil War, Texas becomes a magnet for immigration. You go back to Tennessee, your farm's been burned, you're in the Shenandoah Valley, you got to pack a lunch if you're a buzzard, because everything else is destroyed. You come to Texas and you start over. You start fresh, which is exactly what had been the story up to that point. And that starting over, starting fresh, relying on your neighbors, and being fiercely independent and awfully jealous of your rights begin that double helix of the Texas DNA. When Reconstruction is finally ended, Texas says, you know what, we don't like this whole being occupied by the federal government and being told what to do by the federal government. So we're going to write a state constitution that is extraordinarily states' rights oriented. We're going to be jealous of the state prerogatives of our state. And not only that, we're going to make the government of the state just about as weak as we possibly can. You know, one of the things that people can't get their heads wrapped around is that the legislature only meets every other year. You know, some states, including some that y'all have come from, those lawmakers are busy at it all the time. In Texas, they're probably busy at it all the time. They're just not here doing it. They're out amongst their people. Essentially, if you're at your desk the whole time in the state capitol, you're probably passing too many laws. That was the thinking. So that Constitution of 1876 is now the Constitution we have today. In order for things to become statewide law, real live law, not an appointment, not some sort of gubernatorial pronouncement, but to be actually codified into law, you have to amend the state constitution. That's why there's more than 1,000 amendments or so. I mean, scads of them. We want government to be a little clunky in Texas because we'll solve it ourselves in Kerr County. We'll solve it ourselves in Blanco County, Gillespie County. We'll handle it first, and if it needs to be elevated to the next level of customer service, we'll send it to Austin. And that's the idea. Well, that's fine and dandy as long as Texas is long on cattle, long on cotton, and kind of an agricultural big empire stuck on to that sort of transitional zone between the high desert and the swampy pine trees. You know, it's a strange, sort of glued together place that has attracted people from all over the place. As long as they're just doing that, that's fine. They can be peculiar to their heart's content. But then something happens that changed everything. They discovered oil in Texas. All of a sudden, Texas mattered. And it drove people in Boston and New York crazy. Because all of a sudden, these chicken farmers looked out their window, and where the chicken coop used to be, there was now an oil derrick. And these people who had been hard scrabble now all of a sudden could afford to stay at a real live hotel and get store-bought clothes. And their opinion mattered. Boston and New York, and I would throw California in there too, have never quite gotten over that. They're still a little cranky about it. And Texans are, pretty quick to say, what are you going to do about it? Because we are not an humble sort. All right. It's not till 1936 that we really get the Texas identity that we're all responding to right now firmed up. The reason it was 1936 is because we threw ourselves a gigantic birthday party. It's the centennial of the Texas Declaration of Independence and the creation of the Republic. So they put together a commission and they put together a competition to see who would host the great big gigantic state birthday party. Dallas wins. They hold it at Fair Park. And that's where we get this idea of the Six Flags over Texas. You may have heard of the theme park. When I was a kid, they still had the flags out there. They weren't just little pennants. And the idea was, well, Texas is the way it is because of its experience with Spain and Mexico and France and as a state and part of the Confederacy and part of the United States. So they needed some way to kind of capture what was going on in Texas. But what they inadvertently did is they might have created a unique American ethnicity. Now you think about what goes into ethnicity. What is an ethnicity? I mean, is it where you're born? Is it what you see in the mirror? Or is it the shared values and ideals? Is it the shared identity? Is it the shared language and customs? Foodways? What goes into creating that culture, to creating that ethnicity? Well, I would say after 1936, Texas is well on its way to being a unique expression of the American identity. And I think politically, it has actually become kind of a unique expression of the American ideal. I would argue that Texas may even be the closest state in the country to original intent of the Constitution. Well, I hear some teeth grinding in the back. But you don't get to be Texas without making bold declarative statements and not being prepared to back them up. So there's a footnote attached to that. Now, then, that said, I would argue that every state in the Union has its own unique story that helps add to this great quilt that is the American nation. Iowa has a fascinating history. Wisconsin and Iowa were both frontier places when Texas was a frontier place. The biggest difference was Wisconsin and Iowa had a federal backstop. Texans' only backstop was a Kentucky long rifle hanging over the fireplace. But even so, a Wisconsin story, a Wisconsin state history, an Iowa state history, Illinois, Florida, pick your state, all of those state histories are fascinating, and they're each one a microcosm of the American experience. But one by one, those states really quit telling their state stories. You know, if you're from a state that has a flag that's a big blue rectangle with some people on it, that's not nearly as inspiring as going to a state that has a flag that people recognize globally. I'm just saying that there's an opportunity here for every state in our country to get their Texasosity on. It might be Iowa-osity, but still, God bless them, Americans all. So now, where are we heading with this story? You know, Texas will mark its 200th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence from Mexico in 2036. So you guys, especially those of you that are, younger than 20, that are here scoping out this great educational opportunity here in Texas's capital, you're catching the state at a very critical point in its existence, which means that you have a great opportunity to throw in and lend a hand. You know, everybody in Texas is from someplace else. So don't sweat that if you're not from here. Really, if you are not from Texas and you throw in with Texas, you're kind of double Texan because you volunteered and you persisted. You know, I'm a native Texan because this is where the doctor slapped my fanny. I had nothing to do with it. So I don't have that pride of place that the immigrants do. And it doesn't matter where you're immigrating from. It could be India, could be Nigeria, could be Chicago, it could be Bakersfield. Oh, man, I didn't know Bakersfield was a laugh line. I'm going to add that to the script. Wow, Bakersfield, yuck, yuck, yuck. Got it. Point is, we are a people that throw in for a common cause. And what makes us tick is that we come from a history where we were always the far end of the supply line, always over the hill from any help, where we had to bring in our neighbors, or if your Spanish language was your first language, your vecinos. And the neighbors and vecinos covered each other's backs, and you'd solve it on your own before you asked for help. If you asked for help, you knew it was a crisis. Now, by no means is Texas perfect. We're running out of water. That's kind of a big deal. Our electrical grid has proven to be somewhat slipshod when tested. As proud as we are of having an independent grid, it's only good to be proud of something that works every time you stick the key in and turn it on. There's a lot of work to be done in Texas, but my gosh, the bones of this place are great. Third most spoken language in Texas today is Vietnamese. Number 4 is Mandarin. Number 5 is Tagalog. My chore, and what I'm spending my life energy doing out in Kerrville, is trying to show those people where they fit into that Texas story. I see a room of people that are interested in joining into that Texas story as well. I encourage you to do it. Texas needs every last one of you. And I'll tell you, if you throw in, we'll be glad that you did. So what I want to do at this point is open it up to discussions and questions. Now that you've got a primer on the story of Texas. Thank y'all. So we have a Q&A mic out here. Y'all need to speak into the mic. Don't shout the questions at me because we want to pick that up on the video recording and make this useful for posterity.
Hi, I'm Eliana. I'm a transplant from just over 3 years ago. I moved out here with my family. Now I'll be starting at the University of Austin this upcoming year.
Great.
What is a piece of advice for transplants and anybody who's going to start coming here who isn't from Texas?
Sure.
What would you say, is the biggest piece of advice you can give to them?
Yeah, well, how can you fit in? How do I fold in on this Texas story? Got it. First of all, one thing that just drives most Texans sideways, in my experience, has been when you say, this is how we did it in New York. Don't tell us, just show us. And if it's superior to the way we're doing it, guess what? We'll do it that way. I mean, we're not stupid, but we are just a little sassy and full of our own hubris. So where did you come from?
I'm from Orange County, and now I live in Wimberley.
Okay, so Orange County, you're already sort of politically aligned with Texas, I suspect. You know, a lot of people are saying, all these people from California are moving to Texas. I said, yeah, because they're political refugees. I get that. And, you know, so you're already got a leg up. But just be kind to your neighbors. Tell them that Texas barbecue is vastly superior to any other barbecue. Thank you. You know, you might learn the two-step. If you learn the two-step, you're in, you're golden. There's no advice from me to you. You're already a Texan. You just are easing into it nicely. So yeah, Texans do not like to be told that the way they're doing it is dumb and the way they do it someplace else is better. Sometimes it's the truth, but there's ways of handling that. So good question. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
My name's Tahana, and I'm from Seattle, Washington.
Right.
My question is, what would you say is the best thing invented in Texas and why?
Best thing invented in Texas and why? Well, all right, here we're going to talk about Texas hubris again. Because, you know, Texas will tell you that it's the home of the hamburger, condensed milk. Actually, probably is. So like Borden Eagle brand was probably invented in Texas, certainly by a Texan. But I would say the things that were invented in Texas that have changed the world include the things like the microchip, semiconductor, oil technology recovery, technology that is going to lower lifting cost and make it competitive against other oil operators that have cheaper labor costs and cheaper lifting costs. So a lot of times we want to talk about something like a hamburger. Hey, we invented a hamburger. That's dumb. Okay, that's just dumb. It's meat between bread. You know, everybody does that. But when you're talking about semiconductors, that's a big deal because that's the Gutenberg press in its effect. So Texas has been a technology and innovation leader in the 20th century. A lot of times it doesn't get credit for it, which is part of that sort of burden that other states have with Texas. But I'm telling you, Texas has led the way, and it'll lead the way even more going forward. So congratulations. If you're thinking on throwing in on this great experiment, you hit us at the right time. We're going to need your brain.
Hello, I'm from Central California. Some people would call it Northern California, but Central California.
Not Bakersfield, though.
Not Bakersfield.
Okay. I just want to make sure.
I have family from there, but no. I sort of building on what you were talking about in response to last question. Where do you think Texas is headed in terms of the next decade, the next century?
All right, so about 2036. Let's just go there.
Sure.
I think that we're going to have 50 million people living here. So let's start with that. We're going to have to solve the infrastructure issue because I-35 is just, you know, we're adding more people than we're adding infrastructure. So we got to get that relationship reversed. There's an outfit up in Dallas called Texas 2036. They've got a great website. Take a look at the work they're doing, because they're looking at challenges in education, healthcare, workforce preparation. It doesn't matter what floats your boat. Texas is going to have a challenge in that arena because of this growth. So, that said, when we finally get to 2036, I think that Texas is going to be leading the country. And Texas has got to get it right. You know, you think about it, if we get it right, the nation prospers because of that. And the help from the Indianas and the North Dakotas of the country. Sure, but Texas is just, it's a big place. But if the nation gets it right, the world will be a better place. So what's happening right here on the banks of the Colorado or out there with me on the banks of the Guadalupe matters. And if you're a builder, you've come to the place that's building. If you're a sit back and rester, may not be the place for you.
Hello, I am Joseph Morgan. I remember when Travis County was still occupied by people who were born here.
Yeah.
And when the Broken Spoke was not surrounded by skyscrapers, born here in Austin.
Oh, you're a native Austin guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear the bitterness in the back of your throat. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I'm with you, man. I'm with you.
But my question for you is, as someone who's in Austin, which is loyally Democratic, what happened with the party swap in Texas? Because up until the 90s, a majority of the Texas legislature were still Democrats.
Sure.
And my own great-grandfather was a self-professed Democrat, being
Sure.
part of the William Jennings Bryan party. Could you
Oh,
explain
wow. Yeah,
that?
yeah. He was so conservative, he wore a belt and suspenders. Okay. Here's kind of what happened. Texas doesn't go red until 2003, 2006, somewhere in there. So it's always had a very strong opposing force that helped shape the Texas conversation. So that's cool. What ended up happening is when the Dems went so far left that the conservative Democrats, and I know this is a story in my family, they felt like they were homeless, politically homeless. And as that left trend became more and more acute, you had more and more people looking for any other game in town. Now, then, that said, make no mistake, the Republican Party in Texas is not a monolith. There's factions right and left. And I'm amazed, you know, with my work with the 1836 Project, where I'm seeing the different fault lines in Texas. But ultimately, Texas is the way it is politically because we're still ringing true to that double helix, that DNA, that self-reliance, that, you know, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, therefore this is right and that's dumb. You know, kind of practical, pragmatic approaches to the world. And as long as the opposition party to the administration that's in power now in Washington continues to not find its center, you're going to see more and more drift that other direction. And I'm not sure I'm happy about that because I need a good, strong opposition to whatever I'm doing. And all of a sudden, if you've got one group that is just railroading and the other people are busy, you know, trying to pick out what flowers to put on the table, that's not healthy. So you have an opportunity, no matter how you vote, to throw in that conversation that goes on in Texas.
Hello, my name is Ray, and I'm also Texas born and bred.
Okay.
So my question deals with, you talked about Texas being a unique expression of the American ideology. And I was wondering what specifically about Texas, what about which part of the American ideology does Texas epitomize?
Okay, so what does it epitomize? I would go back to those things that I described as that sort of root Texasosity, that self-reliance, that belief that there's a state sovereignty and prerogative, that everybody has an obligation as a citizen. You know, the only way that you're going to keep a republic is if you have public virtue. And I think in Texas, public virtue is still practiced. in a lot of places. So I think that when the framers were coming up with a new country on earth, they said, we want to build a constitution that is a scaffolding for people to pursue their happiness, which means that government has a role, but it doesn't have such a role that it smothers everything out around it. And I think that the way that we have organized our state government after 1876 is a low taxes, low services model that allows people to pursue their happiness. Problem is, their happiness is not socialized. You're free to go pursue your happiness. If it doesn't work out, we'll buy you a beer. Say, get them next time, kid. But we're not going to bail you out. And I think that that's probably what the framers had in mind.
I was wondering what you think Texas plans to do about the water shortage.
There's a couple of technologies that are emerging. I think that somebody's going to invent a way to bring water out of humidity. I mean, they do this in Israel already down in the Negev. There's an outfit that is really innovative in Abilene, Texas right now that is looking into Gen 4 nuclear power, and they're using molten salt reactors. So I'm up there talking to them and say, man, that's cool. Molten salt, that sounds like sci-fi. And they said, yeah. And what's really cool is the byproducts of this nuclear fuel or this nuclear power is distilled water and medical grade isotopes. So you don't have to worry about a Fukushima or some sort of big meltdown. So that'll be part of it. There will probably be desalinization plants that end up springing up all over the Texas Gulf Coast. Just no way around it. There's going to be too many people. We can't keep sticking straws into the Edwards Aquifer and expect more water to magically appear. So I think the technology is going to whip it, and I think Texans are already working on it. And if there's money to be made at it, Texans are probably going to be keenly interested. So, a lot of people are wringing their hands and clutching their pearls. You're going to run out of water. We told you Texas was terrible. Hey, just back up. We'll solve it. Just give us a little runway and we'll get this done. So that may be naive on my part, but, I'm a history major. What do I know about nuclear reactors? Good question, though.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, I'm Emerson. I'm an incoming freshman from San Jose. And I wanted to ask, how do you guys do it here without any income tax?
Low taxes, low services. And that's just it. I mean, we don't pay for a bunch of public services.
All right.
And so you got to choose. Do you want to be taxed in order to provide services? Or do you not want to be taxed and hope you don't need the services? And that's essentially the formula.
That's very concise. Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, my name is Phoenix. I'm from Florida. Not to be the Debbie Downer of the situation, but I was wondering what consequences you may see in the foreseeable future if Texas, in particular, doesn't start leading the nation in the right direction.
The nation is extraordinarily polarized right now. It's amazing just the conversations I have with my peers. I mean, these are kids I've known since junior high. And one's up in Pittsburgh, one's over in Denver, one's out in LA. And sometimes it's hard to have a conversation with these guys because they're getting their worldview from whatever the headline is on Apple News. And they're not putting in the heavy lift that it takes to really get down to the root of what we're talking about. So that's now the lay of the land. And I'm personally convinced that a bunch of that discord is about over-the-horizon actors that are agitating it. And I have seen this with stuff that I've done where comments will be inflammatory, say on a YouTube video, and they'll forget to erase the Cyrillic or Turkish or Farsi letters. So a bunch of this turmoil is completely manufactured. Let's start with that. So Texas has better get its head straight about how to quit bickering with each other and kind of get it solved. We may not like each other, but we got to work with each other. And we've got to set that example. If we don't, then you're going to have such a polarized nation that it's going to have dire consequences. We got to get the border right, and we're right here. We got to have immigration. Guess what? There's not as many of you guys as there used to be. Just trying to recruit for college is challenging because there's not that many graduating seniors anymore. So we either got technology or we got to have workforce. So somebody, let's say, I don't know, Texas, might want to lead the way in some sort of comprehensive immigration reform and then impose that on the rest of the country. Because, there's solutions. We just don't have the political will, I'm convinced. So I think that if we don't get it right, it'll have a ripple effect as well. If we do get it right, USA, yay. If we don't get it right, I don't like the way the odds are in the future. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maddie. So recently my little sister was in the Daughters of the Republic of Texas essay competition.
Hey, good for you.
This year, the prompt was, what do you think the birthplace of Texas is? And there were like 3 options. I believe it was Washington on the Brazos, San Jacinto, and San Antonio. What do you think? The
Washington? No, I'd say Philadelphia. I'd say maybe London, maybe Rome, maybe Athens, maybe Jerusalem. Depends on how far back you want to go, sister. Those other places that are mentioned, Washington on the Brazos, yeah, that's where they formed the government. The Alamo is kind of the spiritual birthplace of Texas. I tell everybody that's the navel of the world when it comes to the Texas world. But what people carried in their brains when they came to this country is what I'm really hitting at with that answer. And that's what they brought to Texas, partly by having their Constitution in their pocket.
Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I'm a native Texan from Georgetown.
All right.
I was wondering whether you think there are grounds today for Texas leaving the Union and becoming its own country once again.
We are so bad at that. Texas is terrible as an independent republic. I want to go on record as saying that. Absolutely awful. Part of what has made Texas prosper is its connection with the other 49 states. That's just the way it is. The genius of the United States is that you can have 50 different sort of iterations of that American identity. I think that if Texas went independent and became its own republic, you'd be swapping the tyranny of Washington for the tyranny of Austin. So that said, Texans like the tyranny of their county seat first. So I'm not sure that it would put us in a very good spot.
Thank you.
You bet. That's the first independence question I've gotten. When I was at the inauguration last inauguration, there's always somebody that flies a private plane with a big banner behind it that says, Texit. And man, I think that's a terrible idea based on, empirical evidence. Confederate Texas, terrible. Republic of Texas, terrible. Independent Texas now? I don't know, man. I'm not such a fan. Maybe I'm convincible, but right now I am not. All right, I think that we have now burned through every minute we were allotted. Thank you for the great questions. Smart people in this room. Thank y'all.